Good afternoon. Really glad to be here with House Ways and Means and Senate Finance to continue both of our committees' work on the property tax credit. And diving in to make changes there. Our testimony this afternoon is a combination of lessons from the income-based education task force of a few years ago and proposals from the tax department. And while those might sound like two ideas that do not synergize, I hope they will by the end of our time together. There might be talk of bubbles and balloons and sledgehammers if we're really lucky this afternoon. So go ahead, Julia, would you like to?
That must be a health language.
No, it's actually JFO language.
Oh, JFO has, oh. I was thinking Jello. Julia is first. Well,
good afternoon. I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. As the chair mentioned, there is a presentation, put together some slides today to talk through the income-based education tax study report and specifically considerations of changing the property tax credit. Would you like me to go ahead and share my screen?
yes. It's helpful for people that are watching.
Okay. So, I was asked, hold on, let me just see. So I was asked to come in and talk a little bit today about the committee report that came from the Income-Based Education Tax Study Committee. I know that there is at least a few members around this table who served on that committee. So we'll be talking about that, and we'll specifically be talking about one portion of the work done in that committee regarding considerations of changes to the property tax credit that I was asked to focus on today. Before diving into the work, I do want to just lead with a few notes and state that the presentation and the report itself is a review of the work, the findings, the recommendations from the Income-Based Education Tax Study Committee. This aims to sort of serve as a summary and touch on a few points that were determined by the committee. But I want to note right up front that it's neither policy recommendations nor evaluation from the Joint Fiscal Office. We're nonpartisan, non-political. This is reporting on the report. And lastly, there's a few numbers and figures in the presentation that are examples. They don't reflect actual data. They're really illustrative to help think through some of the levers that we're talking about here. So in terms of outline, talking briefly about what the committee was, a review of the principles of a high quality tax system, considerations of changing the property tax credit, and an overview of the recommended structure coming from the committee. So the Income-Based Education Tax Study Committee, it was put out in statute. It was in 2022, or not in statute, in session law. It met 6 times, and it was charged with studying and making recommendations on the creation and the implementation of an income-based education tax to replace the homestead property tax. Over the course of the deliberations, the committee decided not to prioritize the question of if there should be an income education tax, but rather concentrated on if there were to be an education income tax, how should it be structured? So it focused more on the how versus the if. The Table of contents, we're gonna walk through sort of each one of these. For those of you who have not read the report or haven't read it recently, it's got the enabling legislation, an overview of Vermont's education finance system. I decided to skip over those because I didn't think it was especially relevant for today. Then touched on the principles of a high quality tax system, adjustments to the property tax credit and what considerations of those adjustments really are. And lastly, a recommended structure for an income-based education. So first, touching on principles of a high quality tax system. This was section 3 of the report. The committee dedicated a good chunk of one of its meetings to reviewing the principles of a high quality tax system and considerations for an education income tax. All of those presentations are available on the committee webpage. But in summary, you'll recall, I believe that I think both committees have probably heard from Chris Roop at the Joint Fiscal Office about 6 pillars of a high quality tax system. So you'll recall this is from NCSL, and essentially there are 6 pillars that are, I have here footnoted: sustainability and reliability, economic competitiveness, tax neutrality, accountability, fairness, and simplicity. And these are distinct principles when considering a tax system overall. And while they're distinct, they're also linked together, right? And because they're distinct principles, it introduces trade-offs. And no tax system can adhere perfectly to all 6 principles. So policymakers need to consider which of these pillars they want to prioritize and how they should fit together. During the committee, discussions often focused on this tension between simplicity and fairness, and ultimately led to this focus on the question beyond if an education income tax should be implemented, but rather if it were to be implemented, how should it be structured? And left that if question to be further explored by the General Assembly. So getting into sort of the meat of the testimony for today, I know that you're hearing some testimony about potential changes to the property tax credit. So I was asked to focus on some considerations that the committee explored regarding adjustments to the property tax credit. This is outlined in section 4 of the report. And there's kind of 2, as the chair alluded to, sort of 2 topics we'll be touching on that we're calling pushing the balloon and the sledgehammer, which are add a little bit of fun to it. But before getting into it, a review of the property tax credit. I know that you're all familiar with the way that it works, but I think that it helps before thinking about changes, grounding in what are we talking about changing, right? So the homestead property tax, in Vermont, it has a credit based on income. It's a credit that's applied to the following year's tax bills. It's calculated based on looking at household income and at house site value. And lastly, it's a tax expenditure to the education fund, right? So when we look at the education fund outlook, we see that line 1B, how much the property tax credit costs. I've also included this table here, which I know I've presented in both committees, so I won't go into more detail unless that's helpful. But I really just want to outline here that we see that there's these different parameters for household income, and there's also different parameters for house site value that correspond to those incomes. So we have those multiple levers in statute determining property tax credit. So one of the first things that the committee asked and I decided to look at was changing the property tax credit, right? Before looking at an income-based education tax, the committee explored, what if we made changes to the property tax credit? And this is a quote that I pulled from the committee's report. that we'll be talking about in a little bit more detail, but it stated that solving one issue creates new issues elsewhere in the distribution of tax paid as a percentage of income, and it is difficult to achieve the desired effects in a targeted way. Given this analysis and the committee's desire to simplify the property tax system, the committee decided not to recommend any adjustments to the property tax credit. This is a quote from the report. And these conclusions really were in response to modeling that talked about these two primary weapons that I alluded to in the beginning, the pushing on the balloon and the sledgehammer. So lesson one, pushing on the balloon. Essentially, one way to think about this is literally, you know, pushing on a balloon, you push it here, it pops out over here, it pops out up here. And what this means is really solving one issue or adjusting one issue of the property tax credit creates new issues elsewhere in the income and house site value distribution. So what does that really mean? It means that because the property tax credit is a tax expenditure coming out of the ed fund, increasing the size of it or the eligibility of it also increases the cost. Right? If you make it available to more people, that's a larger credit that you need to pay for. We also know that the education fund is self-balancing, meaning that all else equal, the more cost there is to the education fund, the more property taxes that need to be raised to cover that cost. So expanding the property tax credit, all else equal, would also require increasing property tax rates to cover that expansion, which means that many would not see an increased credit significant enough to offset the increase in the property tax rates. We've got a little high-level visual of how this balloon works, right? We are expanding the property tax credit, which means that expansion, higher cost of the property tax credit. To cover that higher cost, we also need to raise property tax rates, unless another policy choice is made, in order to cover that increased cost, that increased tax expenditure. This is an example of pushing on the balloon and how it might work. All made up numbers, really round, solely for the purpose of an example. But let's just assume that the policy decision were to be made to increase the house site cap for households under 90,000 from 400,000 as exists in current law to 550,000, right? So if your income is 90,000 or below, under current law, you can use that property tax credit for the first $400,000 of your house site. Let's say the policy choice were to go to 550, increase it. Thinking about that pushing on the balloon, we're expanding that property tax credit for certain homes, which means that there's going to be a change in property tax liability, and it's going to change based off of those different groups. So for those households that have a house site value under 400,000, they're not going to see any expansion of their property tax credit, because expanding the limit is not going to change anything for them in terms of their credit. What it will mean is that the tax expenditure is increasing. So all else equal, the overall tax liability is going to be increased on those households. For those under 90,000, but with a house site value above 400,000, their property tax credit will increase, because that property tax credit is now being applied to a larger portion of their house site value. How it will be reflected in their property tax liability will vary by individual, because it will depend how much the property taxes need to go up to cover that total expenditure. And lastly, for folks above 90,000 or households above 90,000, they're also not seeing a change in their property tax credit, but they're likely to see an overall increase in their property tax liability. So getting back to that whole pushing on the balloon, the sense is that when holding everything constant and solely identifying that one policy change reducing somebody's property taxes means that somebody else is going to need to pay an increase in their property tax.
Questions? Captive audience.
All right, I'm gonna keep going. That's all I had prepared to talk about for pushing on the balloon. But now talking about the sledgehammer, this is another lesson that the committee explored. These are also terms used in the committee report. I will say these are not just Julia right here, right now, using these terms. But the idea of the sledgehammer is that it's difficult to achieve desired effects in a targeted way using the property tax credit system. So what does that mean? It means that we know the property tax credit is a function of house site value and household income. So adjusting one factor will increase the tax liability for some homeowners, some households, and decrease tax liability for others. This means that there's going to be varied impacts of tax bill changes within income groups, depending on how you're changing those levers. So again, another example here for those whose minds help with numbers helps is that getting back to this sledgehammer idea. So let's assume that the policy idea were to be again to increase the house site cap for households under 90,000 from 400,000 to 550,000. Right? Same policy tool that we just talked about in pushing of the balloon, but now looking more deeply into the same income, household income. We know that because we have these two variables, the income and the house site value, we know that it will impact these households different. So looking at households A and B, both have an income of 50,000. But let's say that they have different house site values, right? Same thing. While increasing that house site cap for household A, they're not going to see an expansion of their property tax credit, but they're going to see an expansion of their overall liability in order to cover that expansion of the credit. Meanwhile, household B, same income, household income, but higher house site value is going to see likely a decrease in their liability because they're seeing an increase in the credit. The logic for C and D is the same as just they have higher household income. So let's get at that complicated, those intricacies of the property tax credit, right? You pull something here, something's happening over here. So moving forward from that, the committee decided to move along from exploring further changes in the property tax credit and moved to considering if an education income tax were to be adopted, what is the recommended structure? The committee chose to prioritize how to structure and administer it to achieve progressivity and simplicity. Again, we were talking about this in the beginning with those principles of a good tax system, right? That tension between simplicity and fairness. Big picture, the committee recommended creating an education tax that had progressive marginal tax rates and income brackets based on AGI for all Vermont taxpayers. And the committee recommended that rates would apply to school district by school district and be increased or decreased according to locally voted ed spending decisions. And that adjustment would be compared to the prior year statewide average education spending. That's the big picture recommendation. There are more explicit recommendations in the report itself. And finally, I wanted to just briefly touch on the conclusion, which sort of pulls all of these pieces together. And the conclusion, I would encourage you to reference it if you're trying to, if you're interested in all of the detail. But it made recommendations on how it should be structured and included references to the general structure and timing, connection to locally voted education spending, some recommendations about credits, withholding, the non-homestead property tax, cash flow, and municipal involvement. And the report also recommended a number of outstanding policy considerations that would need to be further considered and analyzed by the General Assembly if an education income tax were to be explored. And these high-level ideas of considerations that the report goes into more detail included the but the education tax rates and income brackets, a cap on the amount of AGI subject to the tax, how it would be administered, what an expansion or a new renter credit might look like, non-homestead property classification, potential changes to the stabilization reserve, transition, and other areas. I did include a hot link on this slide itself if you're interested in seeing a breakout of all of the recommendations and outstanding policy choices.
I don't see on the list of things that they did consider the exemption that the tax commission has recently proposed, and I think we're going to be talking about next. Do you recall if this committee considered what that exemption change from a credit to an exemption?
I don't recall.
I don't recall us doing that. Do you remember us talking?
No, I don't think so.
No, okay. We did not. Representative Kimball?
Thank you. Just, the concept is to have a locally voted income tax based on school spending. So that seems very administratively unworkable. Was that part of the report as well? The difficulty of establishing that?
Was that part of the report? I would say that was highlighted in some of those outstanding policy considerations in terms of things that would need to be further explored by the General Assembly.
Okay.
So could you explain the difference? I know we're talking about household income above, and then their recommendation is based on adjusted gross income. Is there a difference that they're looking at there? And what is that?
Yes, it's two different ways of defining income. So household income is what we use to calculate the property tax credit. Essentially, the way of looking at it is, in general, all of the income earned by pretty much everyone living under that roof. AGI, adjusted gross income, is what we use for calculating our income taxes.
So again, that household income is really based on somebody's responsibility to declare that, because there's no actual form, there's no form that you use in your tax preparation for that, correct?
So when you're filling out your property tax, your homestead declaration and applying for the property tax credit, you do fill out how to calculate that household income. And it's a different definition than what you're paying your income taxes on, but it is spelled out. So for instance, if I were to be applying for it, I would be looking at, my income, my husband's income, any other income that we have coming in, and that would all factor into household income.
And in that household income, is there also W-2s and everything else that needs to be included? Okay, thanks.
And I will also say, I would encourage, I know that none of my Ledge Council friends are here with me today, but they're really good. John Gray would be really helpful in terms of really parsing out the distinct definition of the two and what does or doesn't fall into that.
Hey, thanks.
Any other questions?
Not for the witness.
Okay. Great.
That was all I had.
I'm sure there's a really easy answer for this. Is there a reason we choose the brackets we choose as opposed to a more continuous measure?
Sorry, what do you mean by the brackets we choose?
We have 400 and 250 for property value. We have up to 45, but between 45 and 90. Is there a reason we aren't choosing continuous variables instead of those lump Just
purely a
leave it
policy
as is.
choice.
Okay.
Those numbers, the 47,000, the 90,000, the 400,000, and the 225, those are all included in statute.
Mhm.
And we're done before the most recent escalation in property values.
And change in incomes,
Yeah.
but what it also does do is drive the cliff. And I believe Sophia is gonna talk about the cliffs. when she comes in. Anything else? Thank you, Julia.
That was easy. Is Stephanie you is, I assume Stephanie is Zoom? Yep, there she is.
Hi, everyone.
And hi, Steph. This room is slightly awkward. You're very far away from where we're sitting here and the mics are sort of far away from so we will do our best to help you navigate the delay that normally occurs in Zoom that might be extra magnified in this extra awkward context. So we will do our best to not interrupt you when you're in a flow and to save questions for the end because I think things will be hard otherwise.
Okay.
And now the floor is yours.
Sounds good. That assumes I get in a flow. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Steph Yu, the Executive Director of Public Assets Institute. And some of this stuff I did cover in Ways and Means last week, so I'll try not to be too repetitive. And I will share my screen. I do have a few slides. But for those of you who aren't familiar with our work, we work to improve the well-being of Vermonters through state fiscal and tax policy, and we really focus quite a bit on education funding. We've been working on it for over 20 years, and that's largely because public education is the biggest responsibility that the state has, and it's the most visible tax that Vermonters pay. So I have three kind of quick goals, and then happy to take questions and dig deeper into any of these sort of policy questions and details, but don't want to kind of get bogged down in the weeds too early. So the three things I want to cover are sort of how we got to the system we have now briefly, and then talk a bit about why the property tax is not working and is sort of the problem with the school tax system. And then, like I say, kind of dig a little deeper into what are the policy goals, and maybe that's part of what I think both the committee and you all might be still working to define, but also sort of the details of what it would look like to move to an income-based system. So, so I think as Julia touched on, Vermont has this complex hybrid system for funding schools, and it's really adjusting the property taxes based on income. And I think it's worth sort of going way back in history, right? And acknowledging that property taxes came before income taxes, largely because people had property before they had jobs, right? Before they had incomes coming from outside the home or working for an employer. It was really about your land or your property. And so that was the focus. So a lot of school tax systems are based on property, but that's sort of a historical holdover more than, a conscious choice, I think. But it's no longer true that most people don't have incomes from outside the home. So I think there's sort of I'm sorry.
Oh, you're good.
Nope, you're good.
I'm good. Okay. So I think it's just sort of worth noting that sort of that context has changed somewhat. But and in response to that context changing, Vermont has been making these income-based adjustments to school taxes for 50 years, right? We started in 1970 with making adjustments for seniors based on their property value, based on their income. And then we expanded it to low-income Vermonters in the mid-70s, sort of, again, recognizing that people are primarily paying their school taxes out of their income. They're not selling off a part of their home in order to pay those taxes. So every year we've, and then in Act 60 in 1997 expanded that income sensitivity to all taxpayers. So I think this question already came up earlier, but we already set an income-based tax rate and a property value-based tax rate for each town, right? We're doing that process now. That's why we have the income yield and the property yield. So we're already making those adjustments based on per pupil spending per districts. But the reasonable goal of this idea of making these income adjustments to your school property taxes was really to make sure that low and middle income taxpayers could afford their school taxes. And that goal, I think, was mostly accomplished, right? If you sort of look at the before and after picture of what that was, low and moderate income Vermonters went from paying as much as 10, 12, 14% of their income in school taxes to paying more in this range of 1 to 3%. But I think the downside of this hybrid system is that when we have to kind of constantly compare the income picture to the property tax picture year after year, it creates a lot of the confusion and complexity in the system. So turning to what we see as the problems with the property tax piece of this kind of hybrid system, and I talked about this a little bit more in Ways and Means last week, so I want to kind of touch on it quickly, but also happy to answer more questions if helpful. So the effectiveness of income sensitivity, that option to pay based on income, has been severely eroded over time. Public assets, we've always focused on how we pay for schools. And the two major problems that we see with the current distribution of who pays are that first, that it's regressive, that we know higher income taxpayers are by definition paying a lower share of their income in school taxes than low and moderate income taxpayers, right? So by definition, you get to pay the lower of your property or the income based. And once you get above a certain point, and depending on the year, this year it's 115,000. Some years it's more like 130, 140,000. It's cheaper to pay based on property. And so most people do above that threshold. But then there's, I think these were also sort of referenced in Julia's coverage of it. And this is sort of how we look at the thresholds, what we're calling these sort of cliffs that are created by the current system, which are both these sort of income-based cliffs and these property value-based cliffs. So many low and moderate income Vermonters are facing these tax cliffs, and those tax cliffs cause these jumps in your school tax bill, whether or not spending is going up in your district. It's whether you cross the threshold or not. So once you cross that threshold for income or you cross that threshold for property value, you're subject to the sort of different rules of what applies and therefore might start paying a property tax piece. So, and I think it's worth pointing out, I think you mentioned the 47,000 and the 90,000. That $47,000 threshold hasn't changed since at least 1985, so that's 40 years now. And the $90,000 threshold hasn't changed for 17 years, so since 2008. So as you might imagine, both Vermonters' incomes and their property values have grown. So similarly, those property values were actually lowered in 2018, and as I think Senator Cummings said, the property values have grown quite a bit since then, and that might have sounded like a pretty expensive house in 2018, and it's less so now. So many more houses have crossed both that $400,000 threshold, as well as many more houses. I actually think the cliff that affects the most people is the 225 over 90,000, because as you might imagine, the majority of house sites now are above 225,000 in Vermont. So again, more and more middle income Vermonters are falling into these cliffs and end up paying sort of 5, 6, 7% of their income in school taxes. And that's that middle share that are paying a much higher share of their income than those at the high end. And again, sort of reiterating that the changes in how much we spend don't fix either of these sort of who pays distribution problems. And I think this is part of what the committee looked at, the study committee. I don't know, was it a study committee or a task force? I'm not sure I know the
I
difference.
don't actually know the difference between those two things. I just make one up.
There you go. But the committee did look at a lot of this question of sort of this disconnect on the property tax side. And I think a lot of the confusion and frustration with the system is because people feel like their choices on town meeting day about their school budgets are not so connected to their tax rates. And I think there's 3 components of that disconnect, most of which is driven by the property tax piece of things. So the first one is the lag, which I think, again, Julia brought up, which, you're essentially taking last year's credit and applying it to this year's property tax bill. But in a year when property values go up quite a bit, that credit doesn't go as far toward your bill, right? So that's one problem, and that's sort of part of the disconnect, the lag. The second problem is the common level of appraisal. So I think, people have there's a lot of confusion around how that impacts people's tax bills, and it does have different effects from town to town. And some of that has to do with, I know there's been a lot of effort to kind of tighten up the reappraisal schedule so that you don't have cities like Burlington where they go 15 years without a reappraisal, and it's kind of a shock to the system when they do the reappraisal. But that CLA causes a lot of confusion for multiple reasons, both because of sort of the changes in the property value, but also because, it makes sort of the state published rate different from the town rate that you actually see. And then the third element, I would say, of the disconnect between sort of what you think is happening to your school budget and what happens to your tax bill is some confusion related to the rates not actually being set before town meeting day, right? We get the December 1 letter, which gives an estimate and a sense of where it's going. School districts have to tell you some sense of what they know, but the yield and the rates don't. So the yield doesn't actually get set until after town meeting day most years. And so there might actually be a difference between what you think is going to happen and what ultimately happens. I'll also add one other sort of side note of confusion, I think, that the property, or stress maybe, that the property value piece of this has on Vermonters, which is most primary homeowners have a mortgage, right? So typically that means you're paying your property taxes through an escrow account for many people. And the whole point of the escrow account is to kind of spread that cost over the whole year and not be faced with these sort of big bills once or twice a year that many people face once they've paid off their homes. But what happens with that is, and I don't know, how the escrow account works, is that there's sort of a reassessment each year of what needs to happen in that escrow account. So you can have this situation where you have this unexpected tax jump because you face one of these cliffs. That means that your escrow, typically your mortgage company would pay the tax bill anyway, but it creates this deficit in your escrow account that then you have to make up the next year. And not only do you have to make up the deficit, but you also have to increase your escrow amount in order to keep up with the higher tax bill. So you sort of get a double whammy in that first year after the change if you've got a mortgage, which again, most primary homeowners do. So I think there's just a lot of pieces in there that are tied to the property piece of the school taxes that cause confusion. So I sort of want to turn to the proactive piece of why we would say that income is fairer and simpler and would make this system a lot clearer to people. So it would eliminate all of these problems that I'm talking about on the property side, the regressivity, the cliffs, and a lot of the disconnect. And it would be much easier for voters to understand the consequences of their vote on town meeting day. I think most people have a much better sense of their income, so they'd have a better idea of what it would mean on town meeting day to be paying 2 or 3% of that in school taxes. You can get rid of the lag. And you can have some sense of what's going on, as opposed to having sort of all the pieces in your head and comparing what you'd be paying for income versus property, what your property tax credit would be, or if you're in this cliff and you have to pay a piece of each. And I think it was raised that a widely accepted principle of any tax system is that it's based on ability to pay. And income is the best measure we have of ability to pay. It's not perfect, but it's the best we've got, right? So the Tax Structure Commission looked at this a few years ago, whether income or property value of your primary residence was a better measure. They found that income was generally a better reflection of your financial picture. I'll add that this recent report from JFO in the fall was looking at sort of how net worth corresponded to income. And while it's true that report acknowledged that it's possible to have a low income and a high net worth, it also pointed out that it's pretty unusual, right? Most people with high net worth are in the high end of the income scale too. They're in the top 10% of income as well. So we don't know the exact number of the handful of Vermonters who might be in that situation, showing low income, but really having high net worth. But what we do know is we know the incomes of the people who are paying by property now. And we know those are the higher income people, right? So all of the taxpayers are paying only based on property now are by definition paying the lower bill. That's how it's designed. You pay the lower. So we know that a big chunk of our income tax base is not covered by school taxes, more than half. As our best estimate, which the latest numbers we have are from 2022, puts it at about 60% of income.
Hey, I'm sorry.
Your slides aren't advancing if you're thinking that they are.
Oh. I don't know. I think, let me see.
Looking at slide 4.
We're looking at slide 4. Okay, thank you for raising that. So actually, I think I'm stuck on this slide for a while. I'm sorry to tell you. We have fewer
Okay, sorry.
choices. You might be sick of looking at it, but I don't have a new one. So, well, now there goes my flow. So I think what I would say here is that our tax policy should really focus on sort of where most taxpayers are, right? Rather than sort of trying to account for the exceptions in that. And I think it's worth acknowledging that if we're worried about taxpayers sort of understating or hiding their income in some way, we're also losing their personal income tax revenue, right? So we're in favor of getting the best definition we can of people's ability to pay, which I think really is the picture of their net worth and their whole wealth. But I think we also want to be clear about why we've had the income adjustments that we have for so long, which the goal of which is that property taxes don't force people from their homes, right? Especially now that the housing supply is complicated and limited. So, I think we can have wealth taxes and we can talk about how to tax the capital gains on a primary residence, but that doesn't necessarily have to be in the context of school taxes, right? It can be a separate endeavor. Now, here's where I've got more slides for you. So I think it's worth pointing out that property taxes are inherently regressive, right? For most states and most places, their property tax system is quite regressive. So I want to show you, some of you may remember some of these slides from the past, but this is from ITEP's Who Pays report that looks at state, it's one of the few comprehensive looks at state tax systems. And what it found was that Vermont's state tax system is one of the few that doesn't make income inequality worse. It's one of the least regressive, but it is still slightly regressive at the top end. And you can see how that's true, where the top 1% is paying a slightly smaller share. And a lot of that is driven by what's happening with the property tax piece. So this is the property tax piece in Vermont. And what you see is that regressivity at the high end, but it's relatively progressive up through about the fourth quintile. And that's because we have income sensitivity, right? This is a combination of state and local property taxes, but it gives you that sense of sort of the slope. We have this sort of progressive on the low end and regressive on the high end model. And again, that looks very different than other states' property taxes, right? So if you look at Florida, that's much more reliant on property taxes. You see it's regressive. Same is true in New Hampshire, much more regressive. They're almost always regressive systems. It's almost always a regressive tax unless you make a lot of these income-based adjustments. And so I think it's worth just sort of recognizing that to try and make a property tax be regressive is an uphill battle, right? It's when we're trying to adjust it based on income and making it behave more progressive, we're sort of fighting some headwinds in the tax design. And so, this is a big part of why our perspective is that it makes sense to just go to a straight income system and not kind of be mired in this complexity of sort of trying to force a property tax to be more progressive and to be something that it's not. So I think I could talk a little bit about kind of the how of this. I don't know how much detail you all want to get into. I'm happy to take questions. But I think there's a couple things I just kind of want to note about income, some concerns that we have heard over the years and want to kind of get ahead of them. And I know that there are things that some of these things are things that the study committee looked at, and some maybe the Tax Structure Commission, but have sort of been in this conversation for a lot of the time. So one piece is that there's a lot of concern over the age of our state and the demographics of our state, recognizing that we have one of the oldest populations and that there's a lot of concern that the income tax base shrinks when people age. And so I think we wanted to kind of look at this and see, is this true? Are we seeing either a shrinking income tax base or a shrinking personal income as more and more Vermonters are sort of crossing that 65 threshold? And the answer is no, right? For the most part, I think there's more to look at here. But we know most baby boomers are already over 65. So 2/3 of them are over 65 already. So that means eligible for Medicare and Social Security. But we haven't seen a corresponding, decline in the income tax base. And even the taxable income, when you look at seniors, and I think Tom Cavett referenced this in the most recent revenue forecast, which is that people over 65 tend to be paying more in taxes because they have more taxable income. And so we don't see a shrinking of the total taxable income, even as we're seeing the population age. So I think that's just kind of worth noting. The other piece, and you all are getting a sneak preview of this because we're probably publishing later today, but I think this also comes up as sort of what's happening in terms of migration with taxpayers and what might be happening there in terms of high income taxpayers in particular. And this new report, so I just want to acknowledge this is taxpayers, so it doesn't show the whole picture of migration. It's not accounting for to other populations, other changes to the overall population, doesn't include births and deaths, doesn't include people who didn't file taxes last year but are filing this year. But so this is looking at tax years, the comparison between tax year 21 and 22. And again, I think also worth prefacing this with 96% of people, of Vermonters, didn't move. Right. So this is really on the margins of what's happening. It's not affecting the vast majority of Vermonters. But when we look at this picture and when we've looked at it over the years, all the charts look like this. We call them the Christmas tree charts because they're almost mirror images. This is by age, but the one by income level looks similar, right? You're more likely to move if you're younger, and you're more likely to move if you're in the middle income piece of things. There's just more of them, right? So there's more movement, but it's also mostly a wash. So I think it's worth noting that, we have seen these increases in migration since 2020 with the pandemic, and the majority of them were coming from higher income households above 100,000 or above 200,000. So I want to turn to a little bit more of the kind of thinking through how an income-based tax would work. And I want to start by just saying what our goals are for moving to an income-based system. The first one is obviously, we believe it would make it fair. It would get rid of the regressivity and make the system as progressive as possible, get higher income Vermonters paying their fair share. The second goal, again, making it simpler, both for taxpayers and sort of what they're seeing when they interact with the school tax system and for administering the tax from the back end. And then the third thing is to ensure that low and middle income taxpayers aren't worse off under a new system, right? So obviously there's variation from town to town, there's variation from year to year, but we want to kind of keep those in a reasonable range. So this year, the income rates range from the base rate of 2% to 3.3%. You might have paid a little bit more if you also had a property piece. And those under the circuit breaker were capped at between 0.5% and 2% of their income. So just to kind of give some context for where people are now in terms of the effective rates, and acknowledging that there's a range with all of this. And I think the committee said it well in terms of acknowledging that it's a balancing act between simplicity and fairness. And trying to make this system progressive would add some complexity, right? It adds more rates and more rate changes and sort of more variables. And I think that's a question that is worth some consideration. We believe in having a progressive tax system and making the system as progressive as possible. And because school budgets are set with a direct democracy vote, where voters are choosing their tax consequences, I think the simplicity is maybe even more important in this situation, that it should be as transparent as possible. So I think in order to have a progressive system, there's a couple of different ways to do it. And they would involve, you could do it the way we're doing it now, which is that you have an income rate per town, and then depending on your income level, you pay either a fraction of that rate on the low side or a multiple of that rate on the high side. I think what the committee was looking at was more of you set the rates and then you adjust those rates based on your per pupil spending. I think either of those could work, but again, I think the key is the transparency, and to maximize that transparency, it's about setting those rates early before town meeting day, making them available to people, and not having this disconnect where sometimes they change after the vote has passed. So I want to wrap up and just acknowledge that, for the recap from our perspective is that the property tax piece of this kind of complex hybrid system is the problem and causing the frustration and confusion and the inequities in who pays. And then moving to income-based would really solve a lot of those problems and make it simpler and fairer, which is what we want in the school tax process. So with that, I'm happy to, I don't think I have any more slides. I'm losing track a little bit, but let's see. Nope, I think that's it. So happy to answer questions.
Steph, when you talked to us last week, you sort of described a halfway point between current law and an income-based system of changing the existing brackets. And I'm curious if you could sort of share that in the context of the bubble and the sledgehammer that we were just talking about with Julia.
Oh, I thought it was a balloon. Okay, but
Balloon.
so right, so I think that is part of what we're talking about. I think it would take some time, and I'll pull up the slide as I'm talking here. So here's what we think that there's an interim step here, because I think that part of the challenge here is that Vermonters want and deserve property tax relief immediately. And I think that an income-based system would take a little time to implement. And so part of what we've been talking about is moving to, is having this interim step of changing those thresholds that haven't been changed for decades. And here's what that might look like. And that's something that can be done very quickly. These numbers are just set in statute and are relatively easy to change on the way to income-based taxes. And so I can kind of walk you through this. So if you remember that slide that I left up for long enough for you all to memorize, that 47,000 threshold where the circuit breaker ends, we would up that to 60,000, add another step to that circuit breaker to cap at 2.5% of income. And then right now, the credit only goes up to a property value of 400,000, again, acknowledging that property values have grown so much. So we would move that 400,000 up to $1 million. And then that 90,000 threshold, which hasn't been changed since 2008, 17 years, we would update for inflation to about 130,000, which would sort of extend that tail of income sensitivity further up. And our estimate is that this would cost about $50 to $60 million, but also lower bills for about 50,000 Vermont households. It would really it doesn't eliminate the cliffs entirely, but it makes many fewer Vermonters subject to any bit of these cliffs. And the idea is to sort of reinstate income sensitivity the way it was before these thresholds sort of got out of whack and stopped covering most Vermonters.
Stephanie, we don't have that slide. Can you send that to us at some point?
Absolutely.
Okay, that would be helpful. Thank you.
And then Representative Odie has a.
Thank you. I do have a question. So,
So,
the property value goes up so high that it may be fine for all Vermont and all Vermonters, but the 60 to 129,999 and the 130 plus, where are those incomes located geographically?
So we haven't done the geographic distribution, although I think it's safe to say that a lot of, that there are clusters of high income and there's certainly geographic differences among them. But the property value piece, I will say, yes, there aren't that many house sites that are above that $1 million mark. Our goal is to sort of get it back to where it was. So before 2018, it was set at 500,000 and there weren't very many house sites above that threshold. And then, but on the $130,000 income, I mean, I can get you a geographic distribution of sort of median income by county or that kind of thing, if that's helpful. But the reason we chose this number is because it is essentially adjusting that 90,000 from 2008 to inflation for today.
I think it would be really good to have that geographic thing. And then the other thing is, if we were to go to 5 school districts, how does this interface with that?
So I think So, it's a separate, I think we could keep these conversations separate, but obviously we have thoughts about a lot of these changes. So the how we pay, there's some separation and obviously there's some connection between how we pay and how much we spend. I think people have talked a lot about the sort of the school tax piece, which includes both the residential piece paid by homeowners and the non-residential piece, have this sort of shock absorber effect in the education fund, right? So if sales taxes go down, the residential and the non-residential taxes have to grow to fill that gap. And that proportion has changed quite a bit over the years. It used to be that residential and non-residential were about 60% of the ed fund. At various times, they've been more like 67, 60. This year, I think they added up to about 64%. So there's a lot of moving pieces, I think, in that question. And I think we'd have to look at again, how would you be setting the rates in these 5 districts? How would you be making the choice of what to spend? I know there's also this conversation around a foundation system. How would a foundation system work in terms of ability to spend above the foundation? I think there's a lot of details that we don't totally know about yet. So I'm not sure I can totally answer the question of how this would work. I will say that we can move to income-based taxes, no matter what your decisions are on the governance structure of the whole system. And I think it would be fair, sort of, no matter how we're going about that.
Steph, I know I think I've asked you this question before, but not for everyone else in the room. The 50 or $60 million sort of cost of some of these adjustments, where is that coming from in your modeling? Is that sort of creating that balloon effect, or coming from other revenue sources, or what are you anticipating there?
So a couple of things. So I think there were maybe 4 little words that carried a lot of weight in what Julia was saying, which is the sort of all things being equal. And I think this is the real challenge with school funding, right? Is trying to hold one part steady, while everything else moves, or, trying to only let one piece move. It's pretty challenging. But the short answer to your question is, I think, the governor talked about targeted property tax relief in FY26. In past years, the legislature has bought down the rate using one-time money, using reserve funds, lots of different ways. I think to Julia's point, if you did nothing else but change the thresholds, then everybody's rates would move up a little bit, right? That the rates would have to adjust accordingly to absorb that 50 or 60 million. Our recommendation is that, assuming that there's going to be some sort of buying down of the rate, some sort of property tax relief, that you target it in this way, because these are the people that are facing the biggest cliffs and paying the biggest share of their income in school taxes. So that's sort of why we designed the plan this way, is to make sure that the people getting hit the hardest got the most relief. I think in the past, when the rate has been bought down, again, it sort of buys it down a little bit for everybody else, but it doesn't do anything to smooth the inequities in the distribution. And our goal is to target the relief towards where that distribution is the most inequitable.
Stephanie, to the point you were just raising there, and I think I heard you say shock absorber, do you have a concern that as we shield people from the impacts of the spending, that's only going to motivate the passage of more and more budgets, thus inflating the balloon, creating more spending, compounding the problem, if people aren't feeling the impact of approving budgets at certain spending levels because they're inconsensitized at a great level? Do you understand the point I'm trying to make?
I do, but I think it's pretty clear that there are tax consequences with an income-based system, no matter what. And I would say that I think that the limits worked, right? I know that FY25 was a tough budget year, but even in a tough budget year for a lot of districts, 2/3 of budgets passed on the first try, and the remaining third, the system worked. The voters said to the school boards, too far, go back to the drawing board. They did, they came back, they agreed on something. So to my mind, that's actually how it's supposed to work, and that's a sign that the system is working. I would also argue that sort of you want there to be tax consequences for the vote, and people are feeling those tax consequences. People hesitate when the school budget goes too high too fast. But you want those tax consequences to be fairly distributed and not hitting some people more than others. So in my mind, moving to income-based school taxes makes those tax consequences more fairly distributed and doesn't encourage higher spending.
And it doesn't encourage, what was that?
higher spending.
Do you see value though in formulas that well connect the spending to the vote that people are making on the budgets?
Right, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I caught that.
Did you see value in connecting the votes that people take on their local budgets to the spending levels?
Absolutely. And so I think that an income-based system actually makes that connection much stronger. I think there's probably also a conversation that's worth having, and this may be another decision point for you all. But when you think about the people under the circuit breaker now, the fact that that's a hard cap, I think that does kind of soften some of the impact of the tax consequences there. So we would want to reform, and I think the Tax Structure Commission looked at this too. I can't remember if the study committee looked at it too, but how you reform the circuit breaker is that you do want this progressive system where for everybody across the income spectrum, your vote is tied to you have tax consequences for your vote. So I absolutely think I think that an income-based system goes a lot farther towards strengthening that connection because people better understand the connection. And right now, they're frustrated and confused because they don't see the connection between their tax bill and their vote, and that's causing a lot of the problem.
Thank you. Steph, this is Ruth Hardy, and I'm a little hesitant to ask this question because I have this like memory back in my brain from the People Waiting Committee when we talked to you about this. And this was before the study committee, the other study committee. So many study committees, right, Senator Brock? My question is, I seem to remember that there was some problem when we're talking about the administration about how we account for renters. And I could be completely remembering this incorrectly, but could you remind me if that's actually a thing?
No, and I think this was something that came up for the study committee, the People Weighted Committee, and probably the Tax Structure Commission too, which is the question about renters. So I think it's a really good question, and I think part of what we have to establish is what are the policy goals around renters. And I also want to be cautious about what we're trying to do with the school tax system versus what's a housing issue or a housing affordability issue. So I think there's been different iterations of the income-based plan where renters were included, not included. I think our recommendation at the moment is to not include renters on the front end as sort of in the initial transition, assuming that the goal is to hold renters harmless, at a minimum, hold renters harmless, at a maximum, maybe make them better off, right? And so I think there's been a lot of changes to the renter credit recently that have sort of disconnected the renter credit from school taxes. And I think you could go back to that conversation. But I think there's a couple of sort of policy questions, conceptual questions that we would want to think about when it comes to renters. One, I think the assumption previously was that renters should get credit for the share of their landlord's taxes that, for the property taxes that their landlords are essentially passing through onto them. I think that's a question, right? Should that count as their school taxes? The way the renter credit used to work was that, and there were a lot of problems with, I think, the way the renter credit used to work. But in theory, if what you were paying, what the landlord was passing through to you in terms of property taxes was more than what you would owe in income, you should get the difference back. We've sort of gotten away from that. And the renter credit, like I say, isn't really attached to school taxes anymore. But I think there's a question of whether we should say that the landlord's property taxes being passed on to renters is actually them contributing renters' contribution to schools, or whether it's sort of a cost of doing business that a business owner passes on to their customers, the same way that somebody might pass on, higher prices, in a restaurant or whatever that might look like. I think if the goal is to make renters better off because we're concerned about renters and housing affordability, I think we've got to have a conversation about whether that belongs as a housing policy question or a school tax policy question. I absolutely, we've done a lot of work on housing affordability. A lot of people have done a lot of good work on housing affordability. We know that most renters skew lower income. Most renter households have incomes well under 75,000, many of them under the 50,000, so close to that circuit breaker mark. So certainly, I think there's a lot of room to talk about how to make housing affordable for renters and what piece of that should come through the school tax system. You know, in some towns, renters are a much bigger part of the population than others. It's less of an issue in some towns, and it's a big issue in other towns. And so I think the fact that right now there aren't necessarily tax consequences to the votes for renters is something, you know, it would be good to strengthen that connection. But the actual sort of mechanism of how you do that, I think you want to parse out the pieces of what's a school tax conversation and what's a housing affordability conversation. But
Okay, but if everybody moved to the income tax, hypothetically, wouldn't renters just be taxed like everyone else on their income?
so, like I say, I think what we would suggest is that they not be included in that income tax system initially. If the goal is that renters are held harmless, it doesn't necessarily make sense to sort of go through many steps, many sort of kind of complicated steps where they have to prove their income and prove their landlord's taxes and do all these pieces. If the goal is to leave them paying the exact same amount that they were before, right? If the goal is to hold them harmless. If the goal is to reduce the burden on renters, but still strengthen their tax consequences and their connection to the vote, then I think that's a different question. I think it's also really tough to divorce it entirely from the housing affordability question and from low income questions, right? Renters tend to be lower income. It's an economic security issue. So I'm all for kind of whatever tools we might have to make sure that renters are economically secure. And I definitely think that in an ideal world, you would have renters experiencing tax consequences from their school votes too and be part of the system. But
Is your suggestion to exempt them from the transition because in a fully income-based system, there would still be non-homestead property taxes?
right. So any income-based system that we've been talking about is really just for the residential side. Non-residential
Okay,
taxes
you are
would stay
still
the
assuming,
same
okay,
as far as
that
we're
makes more
concerned. Mhm. But you'd
Okay.
still have landlord taxes, you know, landlords would still be facing property taxes. But
Got
I
it,
think
okay.
the big decision question is whether you're trying to hold renters harmless or whether you want renters better off. And how you hold them harmless while still strengthening that connection in terms of the vote. I think that's the question. I think it's possible to do, but it does take a number of steps. And if the goal is to hold harmless, those steps might not be worth it.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Steph. I want to make sure we have more than enough time for Jake Feldman from the Department of Taxes here. So we are going to say goodbye to you and thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
We will be talking to you again, I'm sure.
Jake, do you want to join us?
Sure.
Thanks. So did you all take one round of testimony with me? Okay, great. So this is sort of a second round conversation to go a little bit deeper on proposals from the tax department.
Yeah, round two.
Thank you.
And we had a great round one in both Senate Finance and Ways and Means. Really great conversation. So I am happy to present round two. Jake Feldman, Tax Department, and got a new PowerPoint which I'm going to share. I think this one. That one. Okay, so thank you for having me back. Have some more details and also have some preliminary tax impacts to show you. I'll say it again later on, but tax and JFO are building a consensus model on this. It's tricky. A lot of T's to cross and I's to dot here. But we're working on it. We met on Friday. We talked about what year we want to look at, general stuff, and I started doing it over the weekend, but we need to sync up. So there's preliminary numbers from the tax department, but we want to sync up. We haven't yet. Okay, so to remind the two committees here, the tax department is proposing a wholesale change to income sensitivity. And I can't quite see all my words, but we are proposing that the income-based credit system be changed to an exemption that's tiered based on income, and it would be effective for FY 28. We are in FY 25 right now. Tax department is going to start processing people's credit claims that will go out in FY 26. So that's 2 more years of regular credits and then a new system. It would look like this. It would be a bigger exemption the lower your household income is. So for that circuit breaker population that we've heard about a bit so far, which is household income up to 47,000, it would be a 60% exemption from your house site with an additional 10% if you are a senior. If you or your spouse is over 65.
Can you explain that seniors aren't?
Yeah, so we don't currently have anything in the system that's specific to seniors. A lot of states do.
Yeah.
We don't. You know, a lot of what people like about the current system is that it helps people age in place. So this is kind of anticipating, you know, some of the concern there. And it also was a way to try to correct the circuit breaker population a little bit to try to improve the benefit for them. You'll see later on that I wasn't quite fully there, but that's why it's there.
Go on. Take 200,000. What's the average home value in Vermont? Do we know? I mean, 200,000 in the city of Montpelier is a shack. Barely, and I've got a couple ski towns where it might be the garage. So they just sound low to be of any real value to folks that are. Yeah, I mean, 50,000 is
Right. So
really small.
So if it's 50% up to 200,000, what that means is if you live in a $400,000 house, you would be getting a $200,000 exemption. The average property value in the state, I think, was maybe 270 or something is what comes to mind, although I don't want to be quoted on that.
I don't want to interrupt your answer to the question, but do you mean median or average?
I would be median there.
Okay.
Median would be the
Thank you.
statistic to use. And definitely, Madam Chair, lots of variation around the state. The current credit system doesn't account for how property values, you know, vary place to place. You know, it's 400,000 limit anywhere. So, so this is similar to that.
Right, but we just had a massive increase in property values. 10 years ago, I thought if I could sell my house for 300,000, that was above the appraised value. Now I'm saying I wouldn't put it on the market for anything less than 600. And we haven't done anything substantial to the house. It's just the market in what is not a high, you know, we're not a ski area. We don't have a lot of second homes and out of state buyers up in the North Keys Kingdom where it's, you know, it's economically deprived. So there aren't a lot of people wanting to build primary residences. you're gonna have a substantial. Yeah, that 200,000 is a great deduction probably in that section of the state, but not, I'm quite sure in Chittenden County, it's not a really meaningful reduction.
Yeah, and you're previewing things that are gonna come up later in this presentation.
Okay.
And I wanna, maybe I'll say it up front, about Julia's point about squeezing the balloon. This isn't a tweak to the property tax credit system. This is a wholesale reform. That being said, there is a shift in benefit from higher value properties to lower ones. And with your point about your house now being worth $600,000, congratulations. And we are gonna talk about,
My income hasn't gone up.
we're gonna talk about ways that other states, address that and what Vermont might do.
And you use you use thresholds in current law for this proposal, right?
They follow them.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a starting place.
Yeah.
You're gonna see later on, the tax impacts, you know, and it might get your brain's sort of churning on ways to maybe improve from this, but it does, like those household income limits, those should be familiar at this point. 47 is the end of circuit breaker, 90 is the cliff that we talked about. 125 is, here's my little arrow. It was the income limit in 2023. The 2024 income limit is down to 115,000. And 2026 is, so that's 2 years ahead. But that's what this FY 28 would have been based on 2026 income. I have no idea what that would be. So when we're redesigning an entire program for a future year, you really might want to rethink these income cutoffs because who knows?
Well, income in general has not gone up anywhere near as much as property value. And when you get to the housing shortage, moving to a lower value property in most areas is not an option. And so you've got people, I'm gonna guess an awful lot of retirees could get caught because they have high value homes, but they're living on some savings and their social security. And we won't even talk about the cost of groceries on a weekly basis.
Okay, so questions, why do this? And main reason, that's why it's in bold, is it makes it possible for voters and school boards to connect budget votes to tax bills. We had a really good conversation in Ways and Means that I've been thinking about all week, where the chair was pondering this point, and she said, well, you know, how many people actually even vote on town meeting day on their school budget? I feel like the number is 20%. I haven't confirmed that, but I've been thinking about this, and I think last year that setting aside how many people actually vote, I think there was such a powerful narrative in the news that property taxes were going up 18, 20, 22%. And because it's impossible to know what your property taxes are going to be, and because it's impossible for your school board to tell you that in the absence of any good information, people are going to attach themselves to those headlines. And they're going to say, okay, the governor or somebody who is a state house luminary is talking about 18, 20, 22%. That's what I'm going to experience, even though it might not be the case. So I think last year we saw a lot of budgets go down that shouldn't have, but it's just because a school board couldn't really say, no, we can tell you that your taxes are only going to go up 5%. Because the school board can't tell people what their taxes are going to do. Two reasons. The yield isn't set until after budgets are voted for almost all of them. And then net income sensitivity, hyper complicated. So those are the two reasons. And we're addressing income sensitivity right now. and the yield being set, I hope we get to come back and talk about that, because that's also part of the tax plan with the transformation.
Can I say something real
Yeah,
quick? I just want to thank you for naming that. That's really important. I was campaigning last summer and I had to educate a lot of my constituents about what they actually were going to be paying because they had been hearing this message repeated over and over and over again about 22% or whatever. So I just appreciate that you said that. Thank you.
And I hope I don't get in any trouble with the governor's office, but what I used to say is that the headlines last year were
Just
average bills going up 18%, you know, that's what the letter said, and then later on, it got up to, I don't know what it was, 22%. So those were the headlines, and like, you know, that's what people think is gonna happen to them, whether that's the case or not. Second reason, it would make the education property tax more progressive with respect to property wealth, and it would make Vermont tax relief more like how other states do it. I'll tell you right now, this will probably get me in trouble with other people, but there's no state that has a progressive income tax for their general fund and then another income tax to pay for education. Doesn't exist. So when you hear ideas like that and no other state is doing it, or some red flags should go up. But I will tell you that there are lots of states that have homestead exemptions. In fact, Massachusetts, really smart and progressive state. Representative Kimball and I were emailing about this on Monday, I think it was. What they do is they exempt up to 35% of the median house value in the area. So or maybe it's the county. So if the median house value is 300,000, then 35% of that would be about 100,000. So that's exempted from everybody's bill. So if you're in $100,000 house and there's $100,000 exemption, you're fully exempt. Vermont is very different than that. In Vermont, the benefit goes to the high value properties and the low value properties get the least or nothing. So we've arrived at a very different place already. So this would make it more progressive with respect to property wealth, which is a real item of wealth.
So I just want, can you help me reconcile what you just said, which I believe you, and what Stephanie said about Vermont, I think I wrote it down, is the state, is one of the few that doesn't make income inequality worse.
Mhm.
So would us be doing this maintain that statement of we're not making it worse?
Yes. Yeah,
Can you explain how?
sure. So within, and we should look at the tax impacts later, which we will, but within the lowest income group, it would shift tax burden from higher value properties, from lower value properties towards higher ones. But as a group, as an income band, we can get to the same place, an aggregate tax that they pay now. The ITEP report, I will point out that Public Assets Institute was talking about, doesn't include seniors. So, Vermont's treatment of the way income sensitivity works, it really benefits seniors mostly in low income, high value properties. And the ITEP, they're not including that. So, so I would, on the ITEP data, like, I wonder if had they included seniors, if our ranking would have been even better than it was. One more reason, and
The second sentence there, it says, makes the education property tax more progressive with respect to property wealth. So some property has mortgages on and some property doesn't. So then that's not equal. Not that I'm suggesting going there, but I'm just saying, if you're gonna say property wealth, how do you deal with, it's not very, you may not feel very wealthy if you have a big mortgage versus no mortgage.
Well, who's likely to have a mortgage and who's likely to no
Young
longer have a
people.
mortgage? Yeah, so again, seniors whose mortgage has been paid off and are living in a valuable property, it's, you know, it's the truth that is wealth. That isn't, if you live in a $600,000 home with no mortgage, you have a $600,000 asset. That's undeniable. And when you look at statistics on wealth, it's residential real estate and retirement accounts. That's where it's happening. So, the wealthy, you know, own their own homes, the mortgages are paid off, they also have retirement accounts. It's when you get into the top 1% where you get more exotic forms of wealth, like, you know, Tuscan villas and paintings and whatnot.
There's a really great policy brief from Joyce Manchester, from JFO that goes into this a little bit more, because I think there's a little more nuance to where wealth sits. I want to make sure that you have time for your presentation.
It's only 8 slides. I guess I'm being a little bit slow, but I can
It's
see.
not you. I'm sorry, Jake, it's not you that's being slow. We're just asking lots of questions, and that's how I help the group think that maybe we should pause that question for a minute by saying that. So back to you.
Okay, no, I'm good.
Thank you, Anne.
So, for more talk about the wealth subject, and a very digestible table from the census, and other justification for this change, the Act 183 report is on both committees' reports pages. It's ostensibly about an asset declaration for the property tax credit, but then we talk all about this proposal. Okay, so Julia insisted that I make this graphic. Did my best. Talking about the lag. Okay, so current law, there is a lag in the credit system. For the property tax credits that the tax department is about to process, tax filing season is starting now, and people are gonna submit their homestead declarations and file for a property tax credit. They're gonna report to us their FY 25 house site taxes and their income for the household from 2024. We are going to calculate the credit, and that credit with my big fat arrow is gonna be applied to FY 26. So it is based on prior year property taxes and prior calendar year income. There's a lag in it. Acknowledging that, the General Assembly last year voted to increase credits by 13% to try to keep up with property taxes going up, because they are based on the prior year. So that's why that happened. The homestead exemption is not based on prior year property taxes paid. It is based on your prior calendar year income, because when you're filing at the beginning of 2025, you don't know what your 2025 income is gonna be. So we can't base it on that. We don't even know if you're gonna stay in Vermont. So it's based on your prior year income, and it's gonna be a percentage up to a maximum amount. That information is, we can communicate that to towns, what percentage of their house site, what percentage of each person's house site should be exempt. And then they can apply that percentage to the coming year's property taxes. So that means that it will be sensitive to rate changes, and it will be sensitive to situations like reappraisal. Like if somebody's house goes up in value quite a bit because of a reappraisal, this will accommodate that. The exemption percentage, the value of the exemption percentage will also go up, if that makes sense. I see a lot of faces that don't like my graphic, maybe.
I love
Or-
the graphic, but can you show a numbers example? How I can.
Maybe they should have done a numbers example.
It's, with this many people in the room, sometimes we need a flow chart and a numbers example and words, but that's
that's not entirely on you, Jake, to interpret it 6 different ways for us.
That's a good idea for next time, numbers example.
A video.
I love that. I love this.
And you had those
Don't
pretty
not do
houses,
that.
which I
song
think are
and
further in the
And
presentation.
puppets.
So we will keep on, this is not the lesson we'll talk about, so we're gonna keep on working through it.
But the big picture here is we managed to get rid of the property part of the lag, which has been a policy goal for a long time and has been really problematic at the tax department. Some towns like Wyndham did a reappraisal and the credit was not keeping up and we got all these questions. I thought I could pay based on income, and then we had to explain, well, it's based on your prior year and you're gonna have to wait a year for the right credit. So it was kind of messy. So we fixed that, didn't fix the income lag. Can't do it. Some modeling setup assumptions. So we are trying to capture FY 25. Tax and JFO agreed to look at FY 25 because it's post Act 127, kind of a new landscape. What we did is we took what I did so far is I took the FY 26 credits, which tax and JFO had to do for the December 1st letter, and superimpose them back on FY 25 tax liabilities. Because there's a lag in the system, but we're taking those credits earned from FY 25 and putting them back on FY 25 to try to get a sense of current law liability. We don't know 2024 income yet, so we're using projections based on consensus growth equations from the economists. Misspelled the word projected, but the impacts are organized by projected 2024 household income and 2025 house site value, which we equalize because that's how it works. And the figures in the following tables are preliminary. Still working on syncing up with JFL. I showed this graphic in both committees, how the system works now and what an exemption might change. So the picket fence house may be worth $400,000. Pretty flowers walking up to the gate. The income of the people inside is $50,000. So to get their credit, you take taxes based on property. You subtract what their taxes based on income would be, and you get their net education taxes. Small house on the right, single level, maybe worth 100,000, same income, same calculation. Notice that they get a much smaller credit and they pay the same in net education taxes. Those credits, by the way, are going to be applied in FY 26, but imagining them here applied in FY 25. And I think I wanted to show this to you here because again, there's going to be a shift in benefit from higher value properties to lower value properties. Yes, with the exemption, the tax on the picket fence house would go up by roughly double, an extra $1,547, and the small house would be excited. Their taxes would go down by about 50%. Okay, so we need to talk about how to read this table a little bit before I show you tax impacts. So this is the counts of households. Property value, which is equalized house site value, is across the top, those brackets. And down the side are income levels, 2024 income levels. And within each cell is rounded to the nearest 100, how many households there are in Vermont for FY 25. So there are roughly 400 households whose household income is between 0 and 10,000, and they're living in a house that's worth between 0 and 100,000. And then the column total here of 8,400, that means there are 8,400 households where the house site value is between 0 and 100,000. And it looks like 104,600 in all within this universe of households that we're looking at.
Is this all households?
It's
Is
all
actual data?
households with income up to 115,000.
Okay.
There are like a total of it's been about 173,000 total homesteads, in last year. So there's an extra, almost 69,000.
So just to understand, let's say you're a senior citizen and your local property taxes double and your income was still $25,100. Would you recommend that they take out a bigger mortgage to pay their property tax? I'm just trying to figure out how this works.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that.
Okay.
So let's look at some preliminary tax impacts. Red is bad. Balloon is kind of being, there's a lot of red. Yeah, the balloon is being squeezed like this at the moment. So red is bad, green is good. This means that, like, I'll look at maybe this cell, $400 average decrease. So if you match that with the top, there are 2,800 households whose education taxes would decrease $400 on average. And they're between their low value property and their income is between 47 and 90. Up here, there are 100 households in the state whose income is very low, 0 to 10,000. They have very valuable house sites, and their taxes on average would go up $1,900. And then the row averages are here, and the column averages are down at the bottom. So there's general movement from higher value properties towards lower ones. I chose 225 here, and it looks weird because there's a cutoff in the current system at 225,000. And I will say right now that it doesn't fit well, and I flagged this in the study too, it doesn't fit well for the circuit breaker population. You see a lot of red going up to 47,000, a little bit right above the circuit breaker population, there's some more red there. So that is where we should think about mitigation strategies.
Do you have another slide about mitigation strategy?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I talked to a lot of people in Wyndham this year, as I'm sure you did, as I'm sure the Office of the Tax Advocate did. Do you think there's in sort of those 100 people in the 0 to 10K over 400K, are there like folks like that in there, or I'm just trying to understand who that is?
Yes.
From like a demographic perspective. Yeah.
I talked to a few, or I learned of a few households in Wyndham who were between 10 and 20,000 of income, and their houses increased in value from like around 100 to 300 with the reappraisal.
I think you'd find that in Stowe too, and probably over in the Sugar Bush, any of the ski towns.
Right?
I think I don't want to talk about something I don't know much about, but I think with social
That's what we do it all the time.
I think with Social Security, are there minimums that you can receive monthly? No minimum. So conceivably, somebody's income could be between 0 and 10,000 year over year. So yeah, we should talk about ways to mitigate.
Because there's also this urban legend about Trustafarians, or referred to in Vermont. We occasionally found them popping up, sitting on their porch in front of their ski condo, which was, once you bought your portion, your ski condo, you could live on a fairly low income for a number of years, and they had their rebate check from the state. So it's possible in there you have people that do have liquid assets, whereas your house is maybe wealth, at least to your heirs. But unless there's an alternative place of lesser value for you to move to, it's not liquid. You can't. I know what you told our committee, other states do.
Mhm.
Tom Selleck might be trying to sell those too next year, but he does reverse mortgages.
Oh.
No, Tom Selleck.
Magnum
He's a star.
Yeah.
So let's just go, let's make our way through the, next slide and then see where that takes us.
Is that the talking card?
No.
No, that's Night Rider.
Oh, Knight Rider. You're getting towards the beginning of my.
Get the red throat.
Okay, so why is this not fitting well for the circuit breaker population? Here's why. Here's how taxes, the income part of taxes, here's how the credit is calculated for the circuit breaker population. If your income is up to $10,000, the income rate is 0.5%. 0.5% of 10,000 is $50. So it is hard for the exemption to match that. And then you have increasing income rates from there, but it's still quite low in that circuit breaker population. Still in the circuit breaker population, it only covers up to $400,000 of equalized house site value, and there's also an overall cap of $5,600, which is in place. But this is why it's not fitting well. So here are some options for mitigating tax increases. This would be great. Education finance changes that happened at the same time and lowered everyone's property taxes. I can think of three. A big reduction in education spending is one. A new revenue source to the education fund, or moving something from the education fund out of it. Those are the three that I could see. But that would lower everybody's property taxes, and that would help with this, with tax increases. We could construct a reconfigured circuit breaker credit, but it would be paid out as an income tax refund. There is much less, with an exemption, there's much less space that we'd have to cover with a new circuit breaker. The reason to pay it out as an income tax refund is to keep that situation where everybody is paying the property tax in the coming year, which is the main policy goal here. But it could be done. That's an option. We could build in more exemption tiers for households who are lower income. We could build in more exemption tiers for any households really, but to protect the circuit breaker group, we could make an even more generous exemption than 60% plus 10% for seniors. It could be 80%. And then deferral programs are very popular in others. They're not popular. They're very widespread, available, 30 other states, including Maine, which we often look to because of demographic similarities, and Minnesota, #1 most progressive state according to ITEP. They have deferral programs. And those are other options. So, definitely we would like to pursue ideas for mitigating tax increases, for those red cells of taxpayers. But generally, I think that's my last slide. This would be a pretty big improvement, and it would clean up and make understandable what people will pay for education taxes.
On the deferral, do you have more details on ideas for that?
I know that states often limit those to seniors. I would probably pick out a few that I thought were workable and bring them in,
That would be
like
great.
Maine and Minnesota and maybe something else.
You pay interest, I believe you testify.
You have, I mean,
Yeah.
I think you'd have to because money is sitting there. And then the other thing that stinks about a deferral is that, you know, in order to make sure the property taxes are paid is that you have to put a lien on the house, right? So people don't like that. Like, you know, they're in their house, they paid the mortgage, it's worth a lot of money, and they want to leave it to their kids, or they want to sell it when they move into a different place to live. So those are reasons why they're not that popular. But they're really good options that are progressive. Because if you live in a $600,000 house with no mortgage, you're in a good position.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Similar to Senator Cummings, you know, and I gave it this example in committee. So many of the folks that I know that are elderly, that have quite a bit of land and property, I find that hard to consider that a real item of wealth, especially when you're talking about liquidity, the ability to pay. And especially when the example I gave was a farm that is currently burned out, that the husband has died, the farm isn't on current use. I mean, it's a huge expense for property taxes. I guess the other question that it brings to mind too is, what's happening a lot too is people in that situation are having a life estate, where it's still in their name, but they pay the taxes based on their income. Would that still be considered the same if an individual, let's say, only had Social Security, made $15,000 a year, but they owned a $500,000, $600,000 place? Would they still be paying then on that $600,000 value?
Good question.
I'm gonna have to take this question on over email. I don't really remember the treatment with life estates. Yeah.
Currently, they qualify for it. I mean, it's based on your income. You send in a 411, and you send in other form for your house site. And it's based on your income. So again, I just would be curious as to whether that would change that drastically for an individual like that.
You take, I never sold the house, I don't think, for someone over 60 around this area, that the house wasn't in some form of trust. How does that work? I know it's meant to keep the state from taking your house when you go into a nursing home on Medicaid. But how would this work with those trusts?
I think, I mean, the treatment would probably stay the same. I don't think there are different rules for properties that are in trusts right now. You know, they're still eligible for income-based credits. It might look at the income of the trust in addition to the household members, if I'm remembering correctly. But, you know, beyond that, it would be the same situation where you would look at that income and you would calculate an exemption level.
I just put the house in the trust for my kids. I don't get any income out of it. It's just that the trust owns the house. It's a revocable trust. I can sell it. We just did Lady Bird Trust last year. So technically, my kids owned the house. I owed the taxes. I think that be totally, but I mean.
I think that would be something for us to, I know there's
Yeah.
conversations about us moving to AGI from household income, and I think if we were to do that, that would be something we would need to spend some real time considering, given how many more houses are moving into this.
Yeah, a lot of, yeah.
Because right now it's based on household.
Right. I think Senator Brock, you had something, and then Representative Burkhart.
Just a question on mortgages. Are there not certain mortgages in which you cannot do this kind of a transaction? Particularly reverse mortgages, I think was one. Are you aware
The
of?
deferral? You're
Yeah.
talking about the
Yeah,
deferral?
the deferral.
Are you saying reverse mortgages don't allow you to defer
believe that's
property
correct.
taxes? I'm not aware of that. I can research that.
Yeah, because that often for an older person is how money is gotten out of an estate or out of a home that's even in an estate. It's through a reverse mortgage, but my understanding is deferral is not allowed in those circumstances.
I have to research.
Jake, maybe this is coming with the modeling that you're talking about, but you know, Stephanie with her proposal for moving to income sort of gave us an overall number for what the impact would likely be from the shift from what we're doing now to, you know, the new proposal. Do you have a ballpark sense of what the change would be in total property tax income to the state?
Yeah, I mean, this is revenue neutral. So there's no impact. I think with those options that I laid out for mitigating tax increases, those could potentially cost money. You know, deferral program you would have to fill in what people choose to defer. So that would cost something. A redesigned circuit breaker would cost something. But, you know, starting off, the framework is revenue neutral overall. I think if you look at the bottom right in the tax impacts, it's like a 0 average change because in the entire population, there's no change.
Okay, thank you.
Just a couple things, just to make sure, you are still talking about household income for this proposal, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So you still have to go through that whole process of the homestead declaration, calculating homestead income or household income, right?
Yes. Am I interrupting you?
Nope, I have more, but yeah.
Okay, the reason is that we trying to minimize shocks. So if you changed also the income calculation at the same time, then you could create further, you know, distortions.
Yeah.
So for now, we are continuing with household income.
Okay, and it is, an exemption is not a credit. You're not, right?
Right.
Okay, so in the current system, there are checks that do get sent out if the property tax owed is actually negative.
That's true.
Okay.
And if you're buying a house, I went through this twice. You have to pay the prior owner for their property tax credit at the time of closing, unless you agree otherwise, but I don't think anybody
Tried to
does.
fix that at least 3 times and haven't been.
But for a young family, you know, closing costs are difficult, and when you have to pay the prior owner $8,000, up to $8,000 for a credit, that is a challenge. So in an exemption, and I think this is in our draft language, the new owner could apply for their own income-based exemption, but they don't have to compensate the prior owner for their anything.
So one last question, and that is, when you were looking at this, and I know we've exchanged some emails about it, but did you consider what a larger homestead exemption could be without the income test? So applied against the property value, that would not go away with somebody's larger income. You're still limiting the exemption. Did you take a look at that for modeling?
Do you mean something like $100,000?
Sure, $100,000, or even the Massachusetts example, where it's 35% of the average value.
I mean, we could easily, but I can tell that it would be so different than what Vermont does now that it would create a lot of distortions. So that is a format that is used in other states, a base exemption for everybody who's declared homestead. But that gives even more benefit to lower value properties, right? Because So that's just so different than what Vermont does. So we're doing a percentage exemption up to a maximum amount is what we're proposing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Oh, sorry, yeah.
In your survey of other states and what they've done, have they ever taken into account square footage relative to the value of the home? So as the square footage in a downtown urban area is paying a $400,000 house in downtown Burlington, a condominium association is different than a $400,000 house out in the countryside. Has there been any square footage ratio to the price in any of these calculations?
Not that I know of, but there is a lot of variation in what states do. And I can send you what I have for different states. Different states adjust for family size. Is my understanding. A lot of states limit the property tax relief to seniors. That's common. So there's a huge amount of variation, but I don't know of a square footage consideration.
I've been oversending reports to the Ways and Means Committee, but the Lincoln Land Institute has a really amazing series of reports on how valuations happen from state to state, how tax credits happen from state to state, sort of best practices, worst practices, likely distortions from any choice. Good place to dive. Thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Looking forward to seeing you again soon. This might be the last time we have a joint hearing in this room. We'll likely be in room 11 next time. So I'm just gonna take a moment to celebrate that. And Ways and Means, we will see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. back in our committee room.
Senate Finance, just report to the committee room for a couple minutes. Want to do a city debrief or do some press while everything's fresh